Thanks very much, Chloe. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our panel on the topic of exploring discoverability at the ALPSP conference. I'm really delighted to be doing this panel and to be joined by some fantastic people from across the spectrum of the scholarly publishing and library world to discuss this topic. My name is Ollie Cooper. I'm the CEO of Researcher. And we're talking about the topic of discovery today and discoverability. I think we can all agree that making research discoverable is really crucial to enable scientists, policymakers, and readers to make impact and to access and build upon published work. But the term discoverability is a significant concept with a lot of different interpretations and interpretations for different roles across different organizations in various parts of the ecosystem of scholarly publishing and reading and research. So what we're hoping to do in this session is to explore the idea of discoverability from the perspective of publishers, libraries, and content aggregators. And we're going to discuss the technology that exists to enable research discovery, and also to talk a little bit about how some of those organizations are adopting discovery and engaging with discovery and discoverability in those operations and organizations. So it's with great pleasure that I can introduce the panel, which includes Emily Coolidge-Tucker, Sven Fund, Claire DeMarco, and Todd Toler, and also my co-chair, Manisha Bolina. We're going to have a discussion. We've got a few questions lined up that we're going to work through, and there's going to be an opportunity to answer some questions from the audience at the end of the panel. I'm just going to start actually by asking each of the panel members to introduce themselves briefly in turn, starting with you, Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Coolidge-Tucker. I'm from the Harvard College Library, and my role, I help both librarians and then I work directly with patrons. And so for the librarians, I work with them to come up with new material and new ways to teach things like information literacy and research skills. And the patrons that we're working with in that case are undergraduate students, graduate students, visiting researchers, and faculty, so the whole spectrum. And then as a librarian myself, I work with the folks in the Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, and Judaica divisions on their research projects. And again, that's undergrad through faculty.
Super. Thanks a lot, Emily. I'm passing to you, Todd.
Oh, hi, I'm Todd Toler. I'm VP of Partnerships and Product Strategy at Wiley. And my background, I started at Wiley 13 years ago as the Director of User Experience, which was a kind of a fancy title for a publishing company at the time. And my first job was all about discoverability of scholarly content and building out our platforms. And then over the years have gotten very involved with like the Adapon side of things. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Super. Thanks, Todd. Sven?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I'm Sven Fund. I'm General Manager Publishing Solutions at ResearchGate, and I guess I represent here a sort of content aggregator, as Ollie calls it, on this panel. As you all know, probably ResearchGate is a kind of social network with more than 20 million researchers worldwide. My role, which is relatively new since the beginning of the year, is to establish lasting relationships, positive relationships between publishers, small and large, of all sorts, commercial, non-commercial, and so on. We are building on the experience of the past 3 years there, where we have tested different things and solutions with publishers like Springer Nature and with Wiley. And discovery, the topic of this panel, is obviously at the heart of what we do at ResearchGate. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sven. Claire?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ollie. My name is Claire DeMarco, and I'm also at Harvard Library, but in a different layer of the organization. I have two roles, one of which is to lead our user experience and discovery team, and that includes our user research center and our digital collections discovery group. But I also lead our information and technical services team, which is our acquisitions, cataloging, metadata management for both print and e-resources for the entire Harvard Library system. So those two roles really intersect at this point of discovery. And my UX orientation brought to this technical services role helps us to focus on figuring out and prioritizing the metadata that matters the most, both for user discovery and the usability and the connectedness of all of our resources. So I'm excited to be here as well.
Super, thanks, Claire. And finally, hello, Manisha, my co-chair.
Hi everyone, I'm Manisha, I'm from Digital Science, working on the Dimensions team. So my whole job is to help libraries, researchers research and get more out of discovering content, just like Ollie. I'll manage the Q&A, so please be sure to filter through your questions, and I'll put them to the panel after we've gone through this panel discussion. Thank you.
Super, thanks a lot, Manisha. So what I'm going to do to hopefully help the conversation flow and to help the viewer and listener experience a little bit is actually to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go to gallery view. And then what we're going to do is head into the questions. We've got 3 or 4 questions, as I mentioned, which will take up the majority of the panel session. And then, as Manisha said, there'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. Great. So just as we get into the transition into gallery view, the first question is supposed to be a simple one, but potentially is quite a complex one, which is, what is discoverability? What does it mean to you in your context? I'm going to ask each panelist to give us their brief understanding, their brief truth on what discoverability means. And why don't we start with Sven?
Yeah, well, I guess that's a very particular situation that position that I'm looking from at this. So from my perspective at ResearchGate, obviously discoverability is really, first of all, how does a researcher get to the content he or she is interested in? I think that's the most obvious element. In our world, in our daily lives, obviously the understanding of the connection between thoughts that are expressed in content is relevant. And thirdly, and probably most importantly and most different from other places, we certainly believe in a network effect on ResearchGate. We see a network effect, and we see that what we call the science graph that is underlying the system is really fed in a way that it helps researchers to locate themselves in a context of people as well. I think that's the most enticing, to me at least, the most interesting element in a network like ResearchGate compared to hosting platforms, basically. To me, discoverability is not just about finding, discovering, also contextualizing very much what you want to identify, and whether the information, the insights, the piece of content you are finding are really relevant to me in my work as a researcher.
Yeah, fantastic, thanks, Ben. Touching on some themes I'm sure we'll return to, like personalization and the use of interest graphs and science graphs, and the importance of personal network in there as well. Todd, if I could ask you to give us the publisher's understanding of discoverability.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what it used to mean, and then I'll tell you what I think it means now. It used to mean that you tried to aggregate the demand for your content on your website. And then you try to figure out who the people that were using your website were so that you could start to target the experience. And I think that led to a lot of focus on things like SEO and on scholarly platforms. You know, I used to work on features like bulk download, you know, let users download the entire search results so that it can look like they're using the content a lot. And, you know, there was always this sort of inherent tension between the library's privacy concerns and our goal to understand our audience. And there was basically a disconnect between how the content was made and what we did with it after. Like, there were 2 completely different things. And I would just ask the question, you know, how is that strategy holding up for academic publishers? I'm not sure if anybody's really pulling that off. And then I'll cut to now. Now, like so many things, open access has really shifted our thinking. And not because we think the whole business is going open access per se, but because the author is suddenly the customer. And now our role as publishers is to work with the author to make sure that their work has impact. And now suddenly there's a lot more experimentation with things like syndicating your content to platforms who are not just like have it as a sales relationship. but to see if you can put the content in another workflow. And just a bigger emphasis on the workflow in general and trying to speed up the process, things like pre-printing and the fidelity of what we're doing. Just, that's part of discoverability now. So I think that's a major shift.
Yeah, it's a fascinating shift, and the shift to become very author and impact centric is interesting, and to view discoverability as a portal through which impact is enabled is another interesting topic, which hopefully we'll get to a bit more. How about from a library perspective? Maybe Emily, if you want to start off, and then maybe Claire, you can follow straight on from Emily on the library perspective of what discoverability means to you.
Yeah, sure, Ollie. So if we're thinking about it in terms of like patron engagement, then the questions that we're asking in those sorts of reference interviews is, how does the patron's ideas about what to look for match the ways in which the libraries organize their collection? So trying to help make sure that everybody's using a similar language, and understanding again how our patrons are thinking about their research and their needs. So how do they understand and articulate their information needs and their analysis needs once they have the actual sources in hand? What are they going to do with that, and how are they going to engage with those resources?
Great. Claire.
Yeah, and I would just take that a step further and break it into two categories that are probably familiar to most of us, but this idea of known item searching versus serendipitous discovery. I actually think both of those things are forms of discovery, the known item searching and the serendipitous kind, because many of the ways in which our users engage are not just a broad idea that they bring to a reference desk. That's one way in which there's engagement, and then the library staff can help to guide that experience through and help people navigate through the paths that they know and that they've set up as librarians. But the known item version is really interesting because for me, because sometimes we do teach that, right? In legal research, we have the one good case method, where whether you find one good case or you're given a precedent-setting case, you use the tools that are built in to then navigate through the references and through use the citators to check what cases have referenced that earlier case. And that's all about how the publishing platform, originally in print, even for law, and now in an electronic format, how that's making those crosswalks possible. So obviously many of the folks even on this panel are involved in that for the sciences and citing references and other kind of bibliography mining. But librarians have been creating bibliographies for years, trying to kind of give a user that leg up into the discovery realm, that push into where they can find material and then journey through the crosswalks that we've created through the metadata that we have. I think it's one caution, though, is that, as Emily said, we need to make sure that those journeys through the materials have actually informed the way in which we've organized the material, and not necessarily force it to be the other way around. So one thing we're looking for is, when I say that metadata that matters most, it's how are users interacting with linkages in the data to connect to other things, rather than forcing everyone to start with a subject heading, for example.
Yeah, exactly, Claire. And so much of what we've learned about how people are using the resources that they come through has been in what they do in the analysis, which I find very interesting, and is not something that we generally have a lot of. We don't get to speak with our patrons necessarily so much about their analysis component. So it's really wonderful when we do. What are you doing with the stuff that we found?
Absolutely. Well, it's already fascinating to see the breadth of things that are bundled up into the term discoverability. I think we've got a sort of start point, which is the desire to help authors, researchers, scientists make impact with their work. And then we've got a whole variety of plumbing that goes on in terms of creating the right user journeys, in terms of creating an understanding en masse of what our readers, what the readers and consumers of this content actually want what does researcher X actually want to find? Do they want to find things they know about? Do they want to be pointed in the direction of things they don't know about? What do we need to know from them in order to make that whole process as easy as possible? I think there's this kind of, starting point, and then a mass of plumbing and complicated networks to get through, to push content through to get to the end user, and also to allow the end user to pull stuff through as well. And look, at the risk of eating the entire session on definitions, I think we probably ought to start moving on. But look, we've obviously talked about discoverability. We've already embarked on a series of definitions. Is discoverability as a term a little bit kind of inside baseball? Is it a bit kind of, we can sit in a room and virtually and talk about it, but what do users understand by discoverability? Is it distinguishable, say, from something like search, which is a sort of search engine? I think people very commonly understand search as a concept. Claire, maybe I could start with you there. Do consumers understand discoverability? Do they care?
Well, sure. It's interesting that we're starting from search, because I think so much of the library mindset would think about discoverability in an analog format. We have this vision of the perfect past, where people were browsing through a card catalog and then going to the shelf and then seeing books side by side to help indicate some sort of similarity between these things. And I don't want to fall completely into that trap, because I think there can be real harm that we're doing if we presume that the wonderful past was this best way to do things. But I do think that discoverability and findability and usability is a broadening of that concept into where search becomes useful, because what search is actually replacing is not the journey or the interaction. Search is replacing the starting point. And so for me, I still think there's value in using terms like discoverability, because the trap we can fall into is that, keyword searching, for example, becomes the dominant method. And we know a lot about the way our things are organized in a discovery interface that would not, become findable because the keyword functionality for those particular items isn't robust enough. So that's my lead into that conversation.
That's super. Thanks, Claire. Emily, how does that chime in? I know you spend a lot of time, or perhaps not as much time as you'd like to, actually in contact with your patrons and helping them solve their discovery problems.
Yeah, I'm actually just this very afternoon teaching a couple advanced Hollis courses. That's our library catalog. And the questions that people generally get, or the points in those sorts of workshops where folks kind of wake up and they're like, oh, this is really cool, is when we are showing them the different ways to access the back end of our catalog. So there's the keyword search, which people are very familiar with. And then there's also the browse by author, different subject terms, all of which are like proper vocabulary that they can then carry with them across different collections, which they find so valuable, and they can actually do the same kind of research across multiple catalogs, and always bring back some really wonderful interactions with those.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Emily. And so obviously from those kind of interactions, the more sort of interpersonal interactions, Sven, if I can characterize you as a representative of a mass discovery tool, something that operates at a huge scale, and you've got your interest graph to help drive discovery moments. Do your users think of ResearchGate and discovery? What's the relationship between that term discovery, or that bundle of concepts of discovery, and your user motivations?
I think that's really an interesting question. What we have been doing over the last months is compare a little bit discovery on ResearchGate to discovery on publisher platforms, for example. We have done so with our partners, and it's really interesting that the way how we present content matters. And I think, to me, it was a little bit of a surprise in a digital environment. So publisher platforms, as you all know, push out the content, then there are table of content alerts and so on. And you see this spike at the beginning of the usage, and then usage drops relatively soon to a relatively low level, unless you have a Nobel Prize laureate writing on something which is beyond time and space, whatever. On ResearchGate, you can see that the information is rather, and the usage is rather kind of trickling into the system. So we see that through the connections that are being built by content that is being referenced, cited, and so on, you see a much lower curve basically at the beginning, but it's much more long-lasting overall. So I think it's an interesting addition to basically Claire's and Emily's view, where obviously it matters in the library, virtual and digital, how you present content, but even within a digital environment, I think it matters. And what we are looking at ResearchGate all the time is how do we make it as convenient and as easy as possible and create as little influence as possible on how researchers work on ResearchGate, to not basically fall into a situation where somebody at a certain point says, well, this has been displayed to me with a certain intention. That's what we are trying, obviously, to avoid completely. I don't think that we have even an interest as an organization in that. But it's obviously a difficult one because a science graph behind everything is obviously man-made and contains decisions on what's first and what's second. So I believe that that is really something that we need to look more closely into, also particularly with institutions over the next years, to see whether we can learn from each other there.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating point, and actually it touches on something which I'll ask maybe Todd if you could expand on slightly, potentially the negative connotations of assisted discovery, particularly AI or algorithmically assisted discovery, representing the kind of stuff that Sven has talked about, and obviously other discovery platforms familiar with this same challenge, which is to say, how do you ensure that the original intention of using an understanding of a researcher or scientist or reader's interests is interpreted as a sort of benign thing rather than necessarily a sort of negative connotation. There are all sorts of negative connotations, particularly around things like, is this a Facebook style pushing, Facebook style algorithm pushing stuff to me for nefarious purposes? Todd, I don't want to focus you in on that, but I know you've got some perspectives on it, and also from the perspective of your own readers on your own platform. What's the understanding of discovery for them?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. I think whether that kind of mindset about targeting, based on behavior and what I'm reading, leads to good sort of research and scientific outcomes, is versus advertising goals, which are behind the consumer versions of that. I'm not sure that that's really the way it works. I was really interested in what Claire was saying, where you're actually trying to traverse some way through the literature based on the literature itself and its references, or even the way ResearchGate, where you're traversing your actual network of people that that's actually the social graph is this very interesting and useful way to find things. And I'm not sure tuned algorithms, related article things on academic sites are just notoriously useless. They get very, very low click-through rates. And I think it just shows, how long-tailed the content is, how hard it is to find exactly what you're looking for. So I'm a little bit bearish on those kind of algorithm approach. I would like to kind of go back to the opening question though, Ollie, if you let me, because I don't think it's just about search on the demand side. It's also this mindset of just show me the PDF that really drives the demand side. It's really propagated by everybody as this sort of self-reinforcing wisdom that researchers just want the PDF. And it's basically disincentivizing publishers to create richer, smarter artifacts. And we're in a much better position to do those than aggregators or people trying to smarten up the PDFs that we dumb down in our content factory. We're in the position to tag metadata and stick, figures and data sets together and publish it all as rich, interlinked content. But when everybody just wants a PDF, why would we invest in that? And I think it's like one of the it's one of the driving forces behind the problems with discoverability.
Yeah, it's certainly something that to give a personal perspective, we're very familiar with the idea of let me decide what's important. I don't want any engine, any discovery engine, or any machine effectively to tell me what's important. I'll be the judge, which is an important attitude and perhaps a valid one.
Sorry, Ollie, what I'm finding that patrons are especially concerned about when it comes to algorithms is the bias. If they're the algorithms that they are interested in are ones that would push diverse voices to the head of their search results, because that's the concern is that they're seeing only very particular perspectives in the algorithmic world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would just say that that's not just an algorithm problem. That's the biases that are inherent in the structures that library systems and information systems have built in for years. So whether there's any machine learning involved, or it's simply a link between types of content that exist, that problem, and acknowledging that problem, I think, has led to rightly some distrust of that model, and that give me the PDF mindset seems we see that too, right? We see that in our digital reserves platform, for example, if we're trying to control the digital lending environment, and they just, for no nefarious purposes, but are just saying, oh, I just want this PDF because that's what they're familiar with. But I also worry that in serving without context, as Emily is saying, or an active intent to push underrepresented, under described material through to the top, that is that self-serving model that Todd referenced as well.
Precisely.
Yeah, it's clearly a topic that extends well beyond our sphere, but something that absolutely is a critical part of the debate around how we engage with platforms and engage obviously with users around this kind of thing. I'm going to switch gears slightly, just conscious of time, because one of the promises of the session was to talk about how the various stakeholders are engaging with discovery platforms and services. And here I'm going to pit Todd, Emily, and Claire against Sven, and ask for you guys on the publishing side and on the sort of institutional library side, what opportunities and conversely what threats are presented to you by discovery platforms? And slightly provocatively, is there a sense in which you are disintermediated from your users, your authors, your researchers by discovery platforms? And yeah, what are the opportunities and what are the threats? And Claire, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I won't target Sven specifically. I think we know that interacting with familiar aggregators is the way that people are establishing their norms around research practice. So using a different target, something like Google Scholar, is the method by which a lot of those search interface interactions are now trending. But what I think is more interesting than that is that although we have an aggregator concept and the potentially indefinite number, it feels indefinite number of things we could pull back in a large scale search like that, the users many times are still obsessed with this idea of, I want all of the content on this particular subject, or I want all of the things by this particular author or from these particular time periods. And that is not something that any of us can honestly provide. Whether even at working at scale with the largest possible set, that means that the metadata standards for what constitutes, as I said, kind of what is a keyword or where those fields are, what's being searched, is not necessarily going to bring back what the user considers all of the items. And, Emily would be the first to say, when they say that's what they want, the best thing to do is follow up with a different reference question, because that's not what they need. But I do think that that mindset is going to continue to trap us into trying to provide something that might be not doable, unachievable, which is this concept of everything having uniform metadata standards that go all the way to the level of granularity that one would expect. And so I think instead, focusing on the areas where we can have true alignment, like author identifiers, right? There's a huge, with ResearchGate, obviously, there's a huge need and desire to have authors self-identified, to get metadata about authors, to have those connections and those relationships documented, so that then when we use those same author identifiers in other contexts, we're talking about the same people, we can show the same connections. So focusing on those connection points, I think, is the best thing for us to do, rather than, although Ollie, it makes good conversation, kind of pitting us against each other as if I need the search experience in our library catalog Hollis to be the same as it is in Google Scholar or the same as in ResearchGate.
Yeah, understood. And apologies for being more provocative than necessary. Sven knows which side of the fence I'm on in any case. Emily, how about your perspectives here?
Yeah, very, very much the same. The network, I think that's how we encourage our patrons to understand the context of things. So the more we have information about, even the institution that authors are coming from, people can really understand the relationship between what it is they're discovering. And that's going to be based on the kind of metadata, again, that they're really looking at. And author identifiers, having more information about the author than just their name, is the sort of thing that folks find really, really beneficial to understanding the context of their search results.
Yeah, fantastic. There's a huge amount of network value in that can be usefully exploited, if exploited is the right word. Todd, how about from a publisher's perspective?
Well, I mean, both publishers and libraries are already disintermediated by aggregators. So I mean, I think, and that's Google, that's PubMed. I think in most publishers, you're going to get maybe 10 to 20% of your referral traffic coming in from the library environment, like users using kind of, I guess, for this point, I'll say like very traditional sort of collection-based searching, not what we were just talking about, like a really value-added thing. And I think the library discovery systems are starting to innovate in interesting ways because of that dynamic. But I think it's an exciting time in search and aggregation. Like I think it's not just ResearchGate, which with the social graph added a new dimension, but it's also, the Allen Institute with the Semantic Scholar and Meta. Like you suddenly got AIs doing sort of entity-based graphs, and like everyone's building a different kind of knowledge graph. And suddenly it's an explosion in search and discovery after years of being very stagnant. And I just see that as an opportunity for both libraries and publishers. And I don't worry about like the single network effect or the monopoly network effect of one aggregator ultimately ruling it all. I see no evidence that that's happening.
No, sure, and it's certainly encouraging vision. I'm sure with the variety of platforms and the development that's going on in terms of developing understanding, and still ultimately under the banner of making impact, facilitating impact, there's an opportunity to move forward. Sven, how do you react to that positioning, and how do you negotiate that positioning as a leading discovery and researcher network?
Well, first of all, I would say, and I'm a little bit frustrated that Claire wasn't more provocative, but or Todd. But anyways, so I think, first of all, for ResearchGate, what we have obviously done over the last 13 years is 11 years out of them, we have basically ignored publishers and institutions. And maybe you need that. I think there are some good reasons for that. In order to establish something really new, I guess you have to put yourself a little bit outside of the room to start that conversation. I would say that the industry hasn't always been particularly welcoming to these kinds of innovation, which is also understandable. And I think we were simply lacking a proper understanding really of the ecosystem. So I don't want to go deeper here because this has been painful enough to admit already. But I think what's interesting is that we have identified the issue, and obviously in working with publishers and starting to work with institutions, we are identifying the issue. We are trying to solve this. In my view, an interoperability of data at the benefit of the industry, as I think Claire mentioned it, what we call identity at ResearchGate, is really what's interesting. And that's what we are steering towards. Obviously, expanding the network beyond what we can directly control is the biggest benefit. And that's the only reason why researchers would come to ResearchGate and why publishers would work with us and why institutions would work with us. So I think really looking at this from the ecosystem perspective and at the same time promising and making sure that certain information can be shared among the players in the industry is, in my view, really key to move forward. Because otherwise, we as anybody, as researcher app or academia.eu or whoever, will just be one other legal thing that is being basically placed into the ecosystem. It will not address the core issue which we have as an industry, I would say.
Right, thanks, and yes, it's great to sort of have another sort of unifying perspective here. I mean, certainly from my perspective, that interoperability and the ability to share standards across all of these platforms would be a rising tide for all our ships, I think. We've slightly moved on to touch on my next question, which is, and my final question before we get into Q&A, which is, if you had a sort of personal wish list for the field of discovery, I mean, Sven, you've talked about data interoperability, although I'll give you the opportunity to answer again. What's your one thing that you wish would happen, that you could magic up to create a better environment for us as stakeholders, or for you, for end users, consumers, authors, whatever you like? Sven, I'll give you a moment to think of another answer potentially. Maybe Emily, we'll go to you first. Just briefly, if you don't mind, Emily, so we get some time for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. That's a fascinating question. I find it difficult. I mean, I'm thinking through all of my different user groups, and I have a very different answer for undergrads as I would do for visiting researchers. But I think as a librarian, so it just giving them the opportunity, having the end user be able to see some transparency around how things are organized and getting a better sense of the logic behind how things are surfaced for them is going to be my gold star.
Yeah, fascinating, and a potential answer to some of the researcher-led concerns that we talked about earlier in the session. Todd, how about you?
I think the one thing I would want is just the ability to pass the sort of rich linked data web content from submission through to the distribution. Scholarly publishing, research publishing is a very unique form of authoring that almost always has some kind of statistical model. And I just feel like we're not using the internet for what it's good for. And we're still we're trapped in this sort of print world.
Oh, fantastic. And yes, certainly opportunity if we could make that happen to deliver enormous amounts more value through that complex plumbing. Lots and lots of exit points for that kind of data to be used and used to drive impact. Claire.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to have both Todd's statement and Emily's statement precede what I was thinking with this question, which is, even though both Emily and I work in a library, our goals can tend to be somewhat different on this point, right? Because Emily is in a research, teaching and learning mindset, where I've spent some of my career in that mindset as well, where again, your goal is to highlight and help people understand how the information is organized. And obviously from an information literacy standpoint, that's key. And we want that as a general goal, as Emily said, her gold star. But a lot of my work is to try to make some of those things invisible, right? So a lot of my work in terms of the underlying metadata standards, to Todd's point of trying to have, identifiers that can help link data with content from the web and bring that in, is to actually minimize kind of needing for someone to go through multiple stages to find what they need. And so the more invisible that the inner workings are, the thought is that the faster that happens and you're kind of getting people to the content faster. I'm not sure which is best in the long run, or if there's something in between where for someone who wants to ask the critical question of why was this why were these the top 5 articles that came from this search, that they could find that information. We're being transparent about that information, but it doesn't impede the ability to use the top 5 if that's what the research need is. An undergrad writing a paper the night before it's due wants the top 5. And I'm not saying that that's deep and meaningful scholarship for the ages, but it could be that person's path towards then learning and growing as a researcher and then becoming part of the academy in a more thoughtful way. So, you know, I'm not sure where we meet on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps that's the way forward. You know, you have the very simple black box of answers, but an opportunity to open the lid of the box and see inside in a transparent way if you really want to, and perhaps that's a way to fill both kind of user journeys and motivations there. Finally, Sven, I'll just come back to you in case you've changed your answer or want to elaborate on what you said about data interoperability.
Well, I would say I'm staying with the needs basically, and I would like to focus on that at the need of an identity layer, which we have failed to establish as an ecosystem, an industry, whatever you want to call it. And I think there are so many good cases out there. There's ORCID, there's Crossref with a lot of initiatives and so on. And I could name all the other 25 initiatives working there. But I think it's really time to make that step to full digitality and not just putting something which has been print before into digital, that we make that step and find an identity layer, both from on the technology side and also on the governance side, to make sure that nobody feels kind of left out or getting information that they should not, don't want to, or whatever get. I think it's really key to think around that. And my worry is that establishing all these individual initiatives kind of more or less spoils the ecosystem, because especially libraries and researchers have to work with multiple of them at the same time to be interoperable on their level. And I think it's up to especially publishers to get together there and basically cross this situation that everybody feels they need to own something. Probably it needs a neutral point so that we can come to that solution.
Yeah, a utopian vision. Thank you, Sven. Okay, so look, that's going to draw the panel questions to a close. Manisha, I wonder if we've got any questions from the audience that you want to bring forward. You're muted, Manisha, if you're speaking.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, we've got about 4 questions here, and it's really been going off in the chat, I can tell you that. So that's great. So we've got a couple of questions from Odrin Senyal. So his first question is, when the idea of context or contextualization comes up in the issue of discoverability, does the idea of semantics and syntax matter, particularly in regards to the user's information behavior? I think yes, but I'll leave it to you to answer the question. Who would like to lead on that one?
Anyone with thoughts on the importance of that? Todd, you're unmuted. Go for it.
Sure. I mean, I think I would just say, like, the original idea of kind of having keywords that the author provides is kind of one of the, has been almost completely replaced by, automated text modeling, trying to understand the meaning of the text to drive, the algorithms and things that are in the public. We don't even really need the keywords from the authors anymore, kind of thing. So to me, that's what I think of when I think semantic. I think of reading something and understanding what it is. And I think that's pretty much baseline now of how the algorithms are working for trying to raise awareness with authors.
I agree with you, and that follows the question that we've got afterwards. But sorry, Claire, did you want to add something?
You and I were going in the exact same direction with linking this to the next question, because I do think that is the number one tension that I have experienced in trying both to instruct students as a librarian and then also to help direct activities for library infrastructure, is the idea that the expectation is for a semantic web experience, and that what we're delivering is still based very much on direct syntax and almost fielded searching. Todd, I appreciate what you're saying about the author provided keywords. I think what needs to happen there is not that we eliminate author provided keywords, but we start using them in a different way to surface to the reader other ways of crosswalking and discovering new content based on those, because I do think there's huge value in the author being the one to have identified that, rather than, for example, a librarian or a machine that is looking and analyzing how text is stringed together to get meaning from it. So I wouldn't want to move away from that entirely, but I do think it is a significant barrier for users who expect a semantic web experience from any kind of open-ended keyword search.
I also think that that's interesting because not all authors provide keywords. Right, so then you have to rely on the technology. So Tony O'Rourke actually has given quite a good question here: is what about the use of AI in discoverability? How open are researchers to the use of AI-based tools to have content presented to them? I mean, from my experience, and I think Ollie will agree with me, I think they're very open to it when we're living in this kind of Google environment and everything is led by algorithms, and that they're expecting to get good results because they're algorithmically being created. But I mean, what do you think? I think Sven might be interesting to hear from you on that particular question.
That's an interesting one. I have to think about it. It's too early to answer. It's causing too much trouble right now.
I wanted to add though, because I think we talk about the key. This is scientific content or research content. It actually still very poorly described semantically, with just by like reading the text. Like just take a chemistry article. Like there's no words for the most interesting compounds in that article. That metadata is all buried in that figure, and it doesn't get unlocked for the researcher until the chemical abstract service in some building in Ohio where the chemist actually goes through and writes the chemistry informatics on it. And then it becomes available in SciFinder 6 months after it's published. Like we're not even close to semantically understanding scientific content in an interesting way. So I think I just wanted to say, like, there's like so much future room to smarten all this stuff up, not just what the author's providing, but what the computers can be doing.
I agree, and also the concepts or keywords that the authors provide, they actually can, they might not exist at the time, or now they exist. So if you're able to read content through machine learning algorithms and natural language processing, or whatever you want to call it, neural networks, that kind of thing, I think if you're able to go back in time, read those texts, extract concepts or keywords from them, and reattach them and make it kind of like real-time search all the time, what you would be surfacing today won't be necessarily forgotten yesterday as such. And let's take the example of Brexit. That didn't ever exist, but as a word, but the concept of the United Kingdom's, leaving the European Union, is something that was coined in the 60s, but the word itself didn't exist. Unless you have those algorithms that can read them and keep things alive like that and make those inferences and join those things synonymously, I think that then we'll be behind in academic publishing if we don't employ something like that. Okay, how are we doing for time?
I think we probably ought to accept that our next 2 or 3 Q&As are going to feature the use of AI, and probably after that we'll do one on Brexit, just to really scramble everybody's minds. Thank you so much, Manisha. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Todd. Thank you, everybody in the audience. I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. Thank you.